Discussion on the phone, we were talking about High Point, right? Uh, High Point is located on a plank road, Highway 311, part of an old plank road, and is also located on and converges with the North Carolina Railroad right there. And if you go back to North Carolina in 1840 time frame, uh, we had almost completely destroyed the whole pine forest in North Carolina. And as I mentioned, this is the economy, right? Right? This is the economy. Gangs of slaves, all the derivative industries are coming from people hacking lonely. But when they're hacking them, they're killing the forest. They're killing it, right? And what is happening is they don't know anything about forestry. They just keep moving where the pines are, right? And in the wake is destruction, but the pine trees ain't growing back. They're not growing back like they once were. What's happening is they're turning to oak trees, maple trees, sweet gum trees with those spike balls, those trees you hate. Yeah, all that is what superseded that forest. So that's why we don't have that real historical memory, because you have to have somebody save that tree. Somebody saved it. Because that right there would be a $4,000 log easily. Easily. At least. And so somebody saved that tree. But what but but what happens in North Carolina is that we had completely destroyed that resource to the point where we don't grow cotton. Our soil is not as good as the soil out in Mississippi or Alabama, that thick black soil that grows what they call high cotton. It's not even good as the soil in the low country South Carolina, where they grow a lot of cotton. And even parts of Virginia grow better cotton than North Carolina, because the fact that we got sandy, loam soil a lot of places, and it just don't hold nutrients. So cotton can grow in some places and other, but not on large swaths like out in Alabama, Mississippi. So I say that the institution of slavery is starting to decline, in that respect. So the economy is declining as well, and the state of North Carolina begins to institute what they call internal improvements, where, like I said, I'm from Winston-Salem. Winston didn't exist either back then, only Old Salem. But the people in Old Salem and Bethania were saying, well, hey, we got a farm, but we don't have any way to get our products out. Well, the politicians said, well, we'll build you a plank road and railroad so you can get your stuff to Fayetteville or Wilmington and sell it. Well, good. So it passed the legislature, 1847. Legislature passes a couple of bills. They're called the North Carolina Railroad and the Fayetteville and Western Turnpike Authority. And they also have 4 other turnpike roads emanating from Fayetteville, which was the basic hub of commerce and activity outside of Wilmington. And basically, if you can get your goods to Fayetteville, you can float them down the river to Wilmington and get to anywhere in the world, and sell your stuff. So it's a high market potential, to do some things. So in 1848 and 49, after the law passes, enslaved people and free people of color. Also, another law that they passed was the Great Dismal Turnpike Authority. You ever heard of the Great Dismal Swamp? The Great Dismal Swamp is on the North Carolina border with Virginia. It was originally the largest swamp in North America, but people couldn't get through it because it's a swamp, and so they wanted to dig a turnpike through it and have a canal and all this kind of stuff. If you ever go down east and you see these canals, all these boats are, the canals maybe 30, 40 feet wide on some part, maybe 100 feet wide on some other part. It was dug by enslaved people in a swamp with snakes and alligators. And they didn't have a backhoe. They had shovels and picks and oxes. And they dug it all the way from the Dismal Swamp going down to Wilmington. From the Virginia border to Wilmington. Okay? Now, these laws were passed by the state of North Carolina for this work to be done. And who do you think did the work? Enslaved people were hired out by these firms and corporations to do the digging, to build the railroads, to dig the canals, and to make these plank roads. And while they were making the plank roads, they would deliberately run the plank roads through the remnant parts of the lonely pine forest that they couldn't access because they were in swamps and places like that. So they're running the roads through there. On one hand, they're pulling out more naval store industry, and on the other hand, they're building a road through there, going to these destinations, like Bethania in particular was the destination for the Fayetteville and Western Plank Road. So in one year, enslaved people with shovels and picks and axes and wheelbarrows hacked 87 miles from Fayetteville to the southwestern corner of Guilford County. Now, this is not to be discounted because they are coordinating their work with enslaved people building a railroad coming from Raleigh over through what's now Durham that didn't exist, through Hillsborough, what's now through Burlington that didn't exist, over to Greensboro, and from Greensboro down through the highest elevation in Guilford County that's called High Point when they intersected in 1850. So not long after that, High Point is incorporated as a town. And that how it's got its name. But it's really how the enslaved population in 1 year coordinated building a railroad through the wilderness and across places like the Hall River and all those rivers that you cross and all those rivers in the Sandhill that you cross, and they met at exact the same time they needed to meet in 1 year. And then they kept building the road, the final 47 miles to Bethania outside of, and got to was now Winston, that stayed separate from Salem for many years because a lot of those enslaved railroad workers had to stay in Winston because there was no place in Salem for them to stay. So you had two different distinct towns right there for many, many, many years. And then you had the railroad that continued from High Point on through Salisbury and to Charlotte. That is the internal improvement that basically is now I-85 highway, and also 311 that goes up through Winston-Salem and High Point and those roads. Those roads were initially carved and hacked by enslaved people, and some free people of color too. But that's how High Point came to be. And as I mentioned to you on the phone, here is an actual record. Here's an actual record of slaves hired by the North Carolina Railroad in 1864. Okay, and this is significant. As I mentioned, we're going to use this in our Emancipation Proclamation exhibit because Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in what year? 1862, right?
62.
Effective for January 1, 1863, right?
Okay.
Our perception, slaves are free, right? Here's 1864, slaves being hired on the North Carolina Railroad to finish that work. So that freedom is less of a proclamation by Abraham Lincoln and more of a process by enslaved people who are working it out toward their own freedom.